Loose steering shaft. Forgot to get a shot of this column before I started, but this is what it looks like all done, completed. So this column was really loose and wobbly. So in this video, we're going to go through how to break this thing down step by step and rebuild the whole thing from start to finish. There's 2 bearings and a ball joint in here, and all 3 of them can contribute to a loose and wobbly column. So we're going to go through it step by step. It's not that hard. Anybody can do it. To start out, you take your steering wheel off, obviously, and then there's a special tool that you use to compress the spring that holds this black centerpiece on, because there's a snap ring down in there and we need to pop out. So this little tool threads onto that shaft, and then you basically just turn this, and that should be compressing that down, compressing that spring. And once it gets far enough down past the snap ring, now we can pop the snap ring out. That comes off next. This piece comes off, and the splines on this, it only goes on one way. And this is the little horn thing. That comes off next. Then there's a spring right there that comes off. I'm going to take this screw out. Remember, that holds this thing in place. This piece won't come out until we remove that screw, this screw, this screw. I think that plastic piece is connected to these wires right here that tuck up in there. Unplug this, it only goes in one way, it's got a groove in it. Then take these 2 bolts out to take that bracket off. I'm going to take these bolts out, and then take these out, and just take this whole collar down. To get this plastic sheath out, you can just kind of move these wires out of the way, and then that sheet will pull down and out. Now with both of those sets of wires loose, watch this. What do you think, bud? What do you think? So in order to get the lock cylinder out, luckily there's one Torx screw right there. And I guess this is on the newer style square bodies. They have a screw there, that Torx screw that holds the lock cylinder in. The older ones have some kind of a clip down in here somewhere. With this one, just take that Torx screw out. So now to get this black cover off, it's just going to be these 3 Torx. This lever screws in anyway, but that unscrews. I know what you're thinking. You don't want to take this bracket off. You don't want to take all these brackets off and stuff, but if you do, look at what you get. Look at all that freedom. You just make a lot of room for yourself if you just take these brackets off. Just start with that. Makes the whole job easier. So this assembly here, how this works, you got your key on this side, a shaft that comes through, and these gears. So this is what it looks like. Here's when you start the ignition. So to take this assembly apart, just screw right here. Take this little spring, just take it loose. And that goes to this locking pin. And then a screwdriver, just tap on this little shaft. Doesn't take much, and the pin will come out. And this little gear will come out. And then your pin will come out. These little pins have to come out next. There's one on each side. Here's how this little puller tool works. Thread it in there. You just start tightening this one while at the same time holding this one. you just keep tightening that. Eventually it pulls that pin all the way out. Okay, this is the main spring for the tilt mechanism, for the tilt of the column. So you just shove a big Phillips head screwdriver in there, push down on it and turn it, and then it releases. It's got a cap and a big spring. These pink wires down here underneath the column go to the stock. It's got your wiper controls on it. So that's what the pink ones are for. And the yellow ones, that's the other plug down here, the yellow and green ones, they go up here to your blinker mechanism. And hazard lights probably too. But they come up here and they wire into this plastic piece. This little rod that sticks out right here, that's your dimmer switch. It goes into a hole down there, and this piece right down in here is your ignition. So when this piece goes in, this groove right here has to catch this little guy right here. It's got to look just like that when it's in. This collar that goes on here is supposed to have two sets of bearings. One right here, and then one on the back side, kind of below the tilt lever, right down in here. It's supposed to be right here. This is the race for it, and you can see mine's gone. What's left of it is here, just a bunch of balls, but that bearing is completely gone. So this is the kit to replace it. It comes with some other parts too, but you can see there's two bearings that look the same. So that second one is supposed to ride right in this channel here. These bearings have a rolled edge, and let's see, that's the rolled edge, and then an open edge. See the difference? The edge is rolled over the bearing there, and then this is open. So the way the old one came out was with the open edge facing down into the case and the rolled edge facing up, like that. I found a socket that's 1 1/8", and that fits this bearing diameter perfect. Interesting. So the old bearing was installed and came out with the rolled edge facing up and the open edge facing down into the case. So I installed the new one with the rolled edge facing up and the open edge facing down into the case, just like that. But interestingly, that bearing will not roll at all. It is dead stuck in there, and it's supposed to roll like this. So why is that? Well, I think the reason is if you install this, that rides on an edge down in there. So if you install this with the rolled face down like that, the bearing can move. But if you install it with the flat face down, the open face down, it can't move. And it's because this black plastic part of the bearing is bottoming out on the metal case. So that won't move. So that tells me it has to be installed the opposite direction, where now the bottommost part is metal and the black plastic bearing can move. So it's a good thing they sent 2 of these in the kit, because I'm going to have to pull that one back out. There, now you can see there's a little bit of clearance between this metal and this black plastic piece. So now this turns. So that's how it's supposed to work. And you can see that bearing is just flush with the surface here. That's how it's supposed to look. So to review, the open face goes up and the open face up, closed face goes down against the housing. Here's what this piece looks like now with the new bearings in it. New bearing there, and a new bearing there. I've learned that there's another thing that can make these steering column shafts loose, and that is this. This right here is a big plastic U-joint, and that U-joint has to be in there in order for the tilt column to work, but it can have in and out end play that it's not supposed to have. And this is a two-piece kind of a ball with a spring in the middle, and that spring can lose tension, and this thing can just get super loose. So they make a new part for this, so I ordered one. So we need to get this apart. Well, you should be able to just pry it straight up out of there. Oh, I guess so, just like that. Wow, I didn't even have to pry on it. Guess that's how loose it was. So yeah, that ball needs to be replaced. These are the famous 4 torque screws that everyone hates that all come loose. And mine weren't super loose, they weren't super tight either. So I'm going to take those out. I'm going to use red Loctite on mine. I've seen people use blue. I don't know why. I don't ever want these to come loose again. I think it's only the bottom portion there that engages. So I'm using red. And I don't know what the torque spec would be on these, but you can kind of feel. I'm just going to snug and then maybe a little bit more, because they're just machine screws. They're not very big, not very thick, and they don't seem very strong. So the last thing I want to do is break them off. This is the ball joint, or the universal joint that came out of this steering shaft. It wasn't hard to get it out, it just fell out basically. So I want to compare that with the new one. There's a spring in here, which probably at one time was exerting some tension on this, but right now that spring's doing absolutely nothing. The new one has a spring like this that goes in the middle, and that's absolutely going to have some spring tension. Look how far apart it sits. So I need to try and get this in here, and there's a special tool that they list for this that sort of compresses it, but I'm going to try something that I haven't seen anybody else do. I'm going to try a zip tie. Look at that. The idea here is to get this to slide down in there, and then once it's in there, so you don't have this seam, you're supposed to rotate it like that, 90 degrees. That way that seam goes away. I got a needle nose pliers. I just stuck that in here, and then I'm able to rotate it easily. So now I have the circle pointing up, and the seam is through the middle. So now I'm going to cut the zip tie. There. Now this can go in the truck. Well, that didn't seem too bad. From what I've read and heard online, that's supposed to be kind of an impossible job that you need a special tool for, unless I did something wrong. That was pretty easy. So now to get this in here, the narrow part of that joint, this part, this is wide, this is narrow. That just needs to go in like this. So you basically have to have the steering shaft kind of pointed down so that it can slide in there. And once it pops in, then you can rotate it up in place and then it'll be locked in. I think there might only be one way to do this, and it's not the way I'm doing it. See this stud right here? That's preventing this shaft from being able to rotate down any further. I need it to rotate down to more of a 90-degree angle so I can slide this thing right in there. But I can only get about this far because it keeps hitting that stud. So the only place where I could bend it further would be right where the wires are. See, there's a big hole right in here. So I think if I take these wires out, turn the steering shaft that way, then I'd be able to bend it down farther. Yep, that worked. So I just had to push these wires down in a little further to get that black plastic sheath out of the way. And then I turned from this direction over to that direction. So now I'm down in that pocket. There, now it pops right in. Cool. So what that hub should look like once it's on, and there's a space right there, that's where these wires go. This one and the one that connects to this. So they just need to tuck right down through there, and they'll come out on the bottom side. And then this is that little plastic sheath that the wires go inside. So that just needs to go up in there too. You can just probably slide it up from the bottom once the wires are in. These are the pins that came out from the sides of the tilt column. So they're just going to go back in and get tapped in with a hammer, one on each side. And this ring goes like this with the bevel side down into that bearing. So that top bearing rides on that ring. So when this piece goes in, it's got to look just like that. I'm about to put this little gear back in here. But one thing that we want to make sure we don't miss is there's actually underneath here, there's a little spring that this guy kind of rides on, and that could fall out, it could pop out while you're disassembling and cleaning things. So we just want to make sure we don't lose that guy. Make sure that little spring is in there. And put some grease right in here too, because this piece slides on it. To reassemble this side, put the pin in first, hook it with that little spring, and just leave that hang. The gear goes in next. That part of the spring goes in the gear. Shaft only goes one way, narrow side to the left, wide side to the right. The reason for that is the wide side fits in your column or your ignition. Just push that through till it kind of snaps. And the screw attaches the spring down here. Okay, now it should work. Test it. Good. This piece goes in after the bearing, and it goes with these slots forward. And the reason the slots have to go forward is because there's a spring that comes on later that rides right against it like that. So if you had the slots facing the opposite direction, that wouldn't work. So I decided while I'm in here this deep, this turn signal mechanism here still works, but I figured if they make a replacement for it, I might as well replace it, because there are springs and plastic pieces that can break on that. It's probably old and brittle. So here's the part number on that. Okay, the wiring for the turn signal piece just goes right down through this hole. Just like that. And this guy just sits in there like that. So now these wires need to get tucked down into the column and just threaded through this hole back down to the bottom side. There, that one came out. And I'm going to do the same thing with this one. When we take this all apart, we find there's a screw right here, and that attaches to this metal arm that kind of disappears back up under this area where the turn signal attaches. So this arm is what actually actuates this whole plastic turn signal actuator. And I'm going to take the screw out, take this apart, and show you how that connects back up in here. This is the turn signal arm right here. And if you look close, there's a slot in there. It's about the best I can show it, but that piece rides in that slot. And it goes back and forth as this arm, turn signal arm, moves. This lever right here, this is our brights. So when we pull the stalk, that activates this. That has a little black plastic piece that rides on it just like this. That pushes it back and forth. That black plastic piece goes inside this little secondary cover. There's a slot in it right there. So it rides in that slot. You can see that better here. So we put some grease in there because that slides. The back side of this piece is shaped like that, and it comes up through here, and there's a lever that pushes it. So every time you activate your brights, you're pulling on the stalk, it moves that lever. So that's what pushes this piece up and down. To get this tilt spring back in, just grease it up. Put it all in, it rides on a post at the bottom. And then you get the least amount of spring tension if you put the tilt all the way up. Now you only have to push it in that far, versus if it's down, you have to push all this in. So let's put that all the way up, put the cap on it. Just push down with your screwdriver and turn it to lock. Okay, that piece for the brights is now in there. It's riding on that slot like we looked at earlier. So now this whole cover can go on. Okay, we've made it to the most challenging part of this whole process. In my opinion, it's this piece right here. So we have this little slider that pushes on this rod. That's for your brights. So that has to go in this slot, come all the way forward, and I'm kind of sticking it in place with some grease, the best I can. And if you notice, there's a slot right here that this has to go in. So the best way to do this is to make sure your column is perfectly straight. Don't have it tilted up or down. So make sure your tilt is straight. And this piece has to go on before the main collar. It won't work any other way. You can't put it on afterwards. It won't work. So we've got to get this in that slot right there. And it kind of snaps in place. And then make sure this is touching your rod for the brights, which it is. And now it has to kind of just stay there while we try to put this piece on. And that has to slide up into the slot to engage with this lever that we looked at earlier. So this is the hardest part of the whole job. The rest of it honestly is pretty easy. There's not much to it, but this has to go on in a very specific order, a specific way. And this is the only way it'll work. Okay, I think I got it. I can see that that little arm is touching that tab. I guess that's the best way I can see it. Let me see if I can get a pointer here. This arm, this button that came up through the bottom is touching this tab that's attached to the blinker handle. So it's in the slot here where it needs to be. That's all together. So I think I can move forward now, but don't forget to put this piece on because you can't put it on later. The hazard button just goes into a little screw hole right there. So we'll just screw that in. Now that I put this collar on, I'm going to put the lock cylinder in and just test to make sure everything works. That little green tab has to point to the bottom. Looks like everything's working. Put some blue Loctite on these 3 Torx screws to hold this collar in place. Lock cylinder is held in place by this weird little sort of pin / screw. This little piece is for the buzzer when you turn the ignition on. It goes down in that little hole and it's got a spring that needs to clamp onto it. Looks just like that. So that whole thing goes down that hole, and those 2 contacts, they touch these 2 points right there. There's a little green tab that sticks down in that square hole, and so that has to be pushed up and out of the way. I can't hold the camera and do it at the same time. So you just take a little screwdriver or something, push that tab up, and then snap our piece in. And that's what it looks like snapped in. When you put this plastic turn signal assembly in, there's 3 screws, one right here, one down this hole, and one down in here. And you need to make sure that this thing seats flat on all 3 of those. When I put this in the first couple times, it was kind of rocking back and forth like it wasn't fully seated, but it finally kind of snapped into place. So just make sure it's all the way fully seated at the bottom. Next step is to get this black metal piece engaged in that little slot up in here that we looked at earlier. So I slid that up in there, got it engaged in the slot. We know we got it in correctly if our signal lever works. There's a bearing that rides down in here. This is a bearing retainer. It's got a rounded edge here. So this spring just rides on that rounded edge. Here's one huge problem that I ran into. So I got this all put back together, completely reassembled, and the shaft was still loose. It's wobbly and loose. So there's a bearing about right here, and there's a bearing that sits back here a little farther. And that shaft has two spots where those bearings are supposed to ride. But the shaft, there's nothing that prevents it from sliding in a little ways. So since it slid down too far, there was no engagement with that back set of bearings at all. So the tail end of the shaft was just able to wobble around. So what I needed to do is go up here and hammer this thing to push the shaft up in further so that this shaft could fully seat on that bearing in the back. And now it doesn't move anymore. It's nice and tight because this shaft is out probably, I don't know, ½ inch further or maybe less. So that's something really important. That shaft has to be snugged up and pushed all the way outboard towards the driver, because if it's too far in, it'll still wobble even when you get this all put back together. All right, to assemble this next part, we got this snap ring that goes on here, but it goes in a groove all the way down here. This groove right there. So you can see when we put the spring on, that spring's got to get compressed pretty good ways to be able to get that snap ring in there, all the way down there. So what this looks like is, first we have this piece that goes on. This is part of the horn. It's got a brass or copper backing plate that runs up against this little copper pin here. I couldn't find whether you're supposed to put grease on this or not, but I don't know, I don't think so. It might interrupt the contact. This is a spring and it's probably meant to be a wearable part to wear down slowly over time. So I think it's fine. So that goes on. And then this part goes on. This part has a slot in it. You can see right about at the 12 o'clock position here, there's a big wide slot that corresponds to a big wide slot in the 12 o'clock position on the shaft, right there. So it only goes on one way. But now, we need to compress that thing down far enough to be able to get that snap ring to go in. Compressing that spring, and once it gets far enough down, then we should be able to put the snap ring in. Okay, you can't see the snap ring slot, but I can. It's kind of dark in here and hard to film, but I'm gonna push this down. There we go. So that just snapped in place. So now I need to put my plastic thing back in. So that just kind of, the wire's tucked inside it. Like that. And then it slips back up into the column. Like that. And then it snaps over these two square nuts on the other side. This is pretty simple. You just bolt your brackets back on here and then put on the hub of your choice. If you want to put your stock wheel back on, you just bolt it on. In my case, I'm going with an aftermarket steering wheel, so I got one of these hubs. But that's pretty much it. I sanded this down and put a coat of paint on it too. The only thing I didn't show in this video is there's a little spring behind this lever. So if your shift lever is really loose, you can just tap this pin out, pull that little spring out and stretch it out, because sometimes they just collapse over time. So stretch it out, put the spring back in, put your lever back in, and put the pin back in, and then you'll have a nice solid shift lever again. All right, that's about it for this video. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.